put it in.
All right, good morning, everyone. Get settled in here. Teaching from a desk this time. It feels very, very official. So it's good to see all of you this morning and welcome you into this study of the book of Ruth. So that's what we'll be focusing on for the next 4 weeks as we think about Ruth, but think also about some of the connections between this story and the Christmas story that we'll be starting to think about here in a couple of weeks with the onset of Advent. So anyway, I'm excited about going through this and look forward to our conversations over the next few weeks.
You're not as excited as I am.
Well, I'm not.
Your namesake.
Maybe we'll do the Book of Brian next time. The
Life
of Brian.
That's too
That
long.
might get me in trouble, we'll see. Why don't we have a word of prayer to start our time? God, we give you thanks for this time this morning to come together and study your word. We ask that you open our hearts and our minds and our spirits to that which you have prepared for us. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Amen. Well, so how many of you have had a chance to read or reread the book of Ruth?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, having done that, you probably, the first note that I have on my cheat sheet here is where to start. There's a lot going on in the book of Ruth. So before I get into some of the things that I have prepared to talk about today, I just want to start off at the beginning and ask about what reactions or perceptions or questions you have on reading or rereading the book of Ruth. Any thoughts? Yeah, Sonia.
I was impressed that Naomi could inherit her late husband's estate, because she moved to Moab and then come back, but she seems to have been in a position to sell his assets, as it were.
Yes, okay.
So I didn't think that would be the case in those days.
There's a lot of themes in here about sort of the power of women, especially in that society and how things function. Good.
Yeah, I must admit I'd never read Ruth before.
Okay.
So I was wondering about the customs that are occurring, which links up with what Sonia was saying. The fact that she didn't have to collect the corn in any other field, she had to stay in that one
Okay.
field.
Okay, all right. We're going to talk about some of that over the course of the study, but yeah, good.
Is this indicative of where we are now? Because when you look at the beginning in the Good News Bible, it says the peaceful story of Ruth is set in the violent times of the book of Judges. So,
Yes.
relate to what we're up to nowadays, because it's
That's right.
violent times again, isn't it?
That's right. And we'll talk a little bit about the relation to the book of Judges a little bit this morning too.
It was mentioned in the previous Bible study about when they think it was written, or when this story was written down or added to what we now call the Bible,
Yes.
and possibly why. Why did they go? Obviously, after they knew about King David.
Yes.
So was this story in circulation? Was this known before David, or was it because of that it got into the
Okay.
Bible? Of course, David's an ancestor of Jesus and so on.
Yeah. It may be some of both, actually.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Anything else before we? Well, those are all interesting questions. I think it's very, and I think we'll touch on all of those, if not today, then certainly at different points during our study. I've taught Ruth before, but it's been a number of years, and in the last week or two when I got back into it and started preparing for this, I was surprised again at how rich and deep even a relatively short story like this can be, and the many different ways that it connects with other parts of the biblical narrative and how those connections, I mean, it stands alone as a beautiful story, but it also is so interconnected with a lot of other things in the Bible. It's really, really fascinating. So, first of all, just a couple of comments about why we might study Ruth during the season of Advent. Any thoughts?
It's the connection back with, or forward with Jesus.
Okay,
They-
so there's the connection with the
gospel, like
genealogy of
history,
Jesus.
hereditary, yeah.
That's right.
Exactly, the little genealogy at the end,
Yes.
of the end of the book. It's like
Yes,
preamble.
that's right, that's right.
There's the importance of the woman, as in Mary in the birth of Jesus. They come to the fore, the women.
Yep, okay, very good. What else? There's a really obvious one.
The journeys that are made.
The journeys,
that are made.
okay.
Bethlehem.
Bethlehem, yeah. Takes place in Bethlehem, which, of course, we remember from our readings in Advent and readings about the Christmas story. Why are Mary and Joseph in Bethlehem? They went because they're descendants of David, and they had to go and be registered in the town of David. So yeah, even though this is several generations before David, there's the connection with the location. Ruth becomes an ancestor of Jesus. Let's see, I get to that later, I think. Yeah. Well, I tell you what, let's start by following that up about Ruth being an ancestor of Jesus. If you turn to, it'll be the first page of the Gospel of Matthew. Which I should probably grab out of here.
Page 3.
Page 3.
Looking at Matthew first.
So would someone like to read from the beginning up until when King David is mentioned?
This is the list of the ancestors of Jesus Christ, a descendant of David, who was a descendant of Abraham. For Abraham to King David, the following ancestors are listed: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah and his brothers, then Perez and Zerah. Their mother was Tamar, Hezron, Ram, Aminadab, Davshon, Salmon. Boaz, his mother was Rahab. Obed, his mother was Ruth, Jesse, and King David.
All right. So, so that obviously is a pretty direct connection then between the nativity story and Ruth as a ancestor of both David and therefore Jesus. When we read that, you may have noticed most of the names mentioned were men, which probably doesn't surprise us because with the patriarchal nature of the society and culture at the time, that's how your descendants would be determined. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. We'll talk about the Levirate marriage traditions, which we see going on in here as well. But among those names, there are 3 women.
And they're all the mothers, aren't they? Their mothers are
In
mentioned.
Their mothers.
Yes.
In brackets.
In brackets, yes,
Yeah.
yes. And but on the whole, I think it's somewhat remarkable that they are listed. In part, it's because their stories are told in the Old Testament. But I think there's some other connections. So the 3 of them were Ruth, were Rahab, and Tamar. And we will come back to them in a little bit, but that's another thing to kind of watch, is how those other two women are important to the nature of this story as well. I think there are a couple of major themes at work, major themes that are shared with the gospel that are at work here in this story. What sorts of themes, if you've read through the whole book, what sorts of things pop out at you? What are kind of the important themes of Ruth?
The love of God through it.
Love of God,
Yeah.
okay, yeah.
Relationships with foreigners.
Relationships with foreigners or outsiders.
What they decided to for foreigners.
Yes, okay. I think there's also, and this is made a little clearer depending upon which translation you read and which words they choose to translate, but there's certainly a theme of redemption in here. There's literal redemption, which is sort of the work of the story where Ruth finds a new husband, and we'll talk about the value of having a male heir and sort of how that related back to, it was especially important for the mother. And then there's also just general redemption. There's this whole story. Naomi is redeemed in this story. Kind of all the it's just a feel-good kind of happily ever after kind of story. The other,
no one dies in this book.
well, in the beginning, in the
beginning.
beginning.
No one dies violently.
That's right. That's right. The other thing to watch for as you go through it is the movement in here from, and again, you can see this in various places, the movement from emptiness to fullness. And so it's reflected in the emptiness that Naomi feels on the loss of her husband and her two sons. At the end, spoiler alert, there's a baby, and so she kind of has that fullness. There's the issues of hunger, where they're going to have to eat, and they get the gleanings from Boaz's field, and so they're full. So there's a lot of that at play in here too, and so I just point that out.
Had a very strong personality for the time, didn't she?
Yeah, she's a fascinating character in that way, and we'll talk in a minute a little bit about sort of the social roles were obviously much different in that era.
Was she intended as a role model when this was written down?
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, you think about a story like this, that in a lot of ways the primary protagonists in this story are both women. They're both women who certainly would not have been considered wholly acceptable at the time. Naomi is a widow with no male heir, which is problematic, especially for her survival. You have Ruth, who is not just a foreigner, an outsider, but a Moabite, which we'll come back to who the Moabs were. And so very unlikely, and they're women who, unfortunately, at this point in history, was certainly a second-class sort of situation. And so, I think it's interesting that at the time when the biblical canon was kind of put together, that this was one of those stories that made it through. And so we'll talk about that at various points about why it's important to have this story. So what my plan for today is, I have some background information that I'm to share to hopefully help provide some more context into what it is that we're studying. And and then we'll just open it up for some conversation, especially about what's going on in the first chapter of Ruth. So I want to start, looking at some sort of foundational background information. I think Mike mentioned the connection with Judges earlier. So in the Christian Bible, Ruth follows the book of Judges. And primarily that's because of one of the first lines in the book talks about in the time of the Judges, kind of setting the time frame for when this story took place. But if you go back and look at the very last verse of the book of Judges, so that'd be 21, verse 25. What does that say in the Good News translation?
There was no king in Israel at that time. Everyone did just as they pleased.
Okay, yeah. So in the NRSV, very similar. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. So at the end of Judges, if we want to kind of have a social setting for when the story takes place, it sounds pretty chaotic, doesn't it? Everybody kind of does what they please. There's not a king, there's not a central sort of authority in place. So in our Bibles, Ruth is situated in the midst of the story of Judges. In the Jewish tradition, the authorship of Ruth is ascribed to the prophet Samuel by tradition, and it is classified, if you've studied the Hebrew Bible before, or know anything about it, it's organized a little bit differently than our Bible and our Old Testament is. So Ruth is classified as one of the writings, and is designated as one of the 5 scrolls that are used at various feast days in Jewish tradition. So the other 4 scrolls are Song of Songs, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, the book of Ruth, and the book of Esther. So they kind of group those together. And in some Jewish communities, especially among the Ashkenazi Jews, the book of Ruth is read in worship prior to the Torah reading on the morning of Shavuot, which is the Feast of Weeks, which is really, it's Pentecost. It's
Relevant.
Yeah. So, so there's kind of some interesting connections with that. So thinking back, the names, the meaning of the names, and if you use a study Bible, you may have seen some of this. The meaning of the names in this story are kind of interesting. The meaning of Ruth is not clear. Do you know what Ruth means? Do you have any idea?
Well, I know what it is to be ruthless.
Well, there you go.
So therefore, that is without compassion.
Yeah.
So Ruth, to me, is compassion.
Very good. Very good. Very good.
It's okay, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
It's said to be the derivation of Ruel, which is a friend of God.
Okay.
Which is a what, sorry?
A friend of God.
A friend of God.
A derivation of Ruel, meaning friend of God. Good. Naomi, her mother-in-law, that name means sweetness or pleasantness. But if you've read ahead, you'll notice that when she returns to Bethlehem, she tells people to call her Mara, which means bitterness. Boaz generally means strong or quick, someone of strength. And Elimelech, who is Naomi's late husband, his name means my God is king. So if you think back to the end of Judges, there was no king.
There was no king.
But Elimelech means my God is king. Orpah, who is the other daughter-in-law, her name literally means nape, like the back of the neck.
Oh.
As when she turns and goes home, they see the nape.
Well, that's
And the two sons of Naomi, Mahlon and Chilion, are cognates for Hebrew words that mean deceased and perishing. They aren't the exact word, but they sound like the Hebrew for deceased and perishing. So I think there's probably some discussion about, this story intended as sort of a parable. If you think about some of the ways that Jesus...
A new baby boy, you wouldn't call him deceased, would you?
You would not think so, no. So, so there seems to be a lot of allegory at work in these names, which I think, the happily ever after piece of it, it's kind of neatly wrapped up, but it certainly has meaning and it has purpose. And I think if we think of it in kind of in terms of a parable, we think about the ways that Jesus so often teaches in parables, and the ways and the depth that come from those sorts of teachings, which are obviously stories that he's telling, but contain, some of these deep truths about life, about God, about our relationship with God, and all of those sorts of things. So those are the primary characters, and some background on them. Now, one of the things that is very prominent in this story is the concern about finding Ruth a husband. So what do we know about that? How did that work? Why was that so important?
If you don't have a husband, you have no rights, you have no land, you have no property, you are nothing really, because the men owned all the property, they had the power, and if you're on your own, same as widows, you are left. There wasn't any, social services,
Yes.
and there wasn't any NHS. You would
Yes.
have no protection, you probably have no money, no income,
Yeah,
therefore nothing.
yeah. And so the status really came from the woman's husband. And if and when the husband passed away, then that connection moved to the son, the eldest son, in that fashion. So, there is instructions in the Old Testament about how people are to handle this situation if it happens. And it's called Levirate marriage. Anybody want to take a stab at what that involves? Sorry.
What's the word?
Levirate.
It means you take husband's brother.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, because it's in Leviticus, that's the...
Well, actually, where it comes from is in Deuteronomy. We can look at that. Deuteronomy, chapter 25. Let me find that in here. 25. Verses 5 to 10.
So that's got 195, it's not the
Yeah, does anybody want to read 5 through 10? It's basically the section called Duty to a Dead Brother.
If two brothers live on the same property and one of them dies, leaving no son, then his widow is not to be married to someone outside the family. It is the duty of the dead man's brother to marry her. The first son that they have will be considered the son of the dead man, so that his family line will continue in Israel. But if the dead man's brother does not want to marry her, she is to go before the town leaders and say, "My husband's brother will not do his duty. He refuses to give his brother a descendant among the people of Israel." Then the town leaders are to summon him and speak to him. If he still refuses to marry her, his brother's widow is to go up to him in the presence of the town leaders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, "This is what happens to the man who refuses to give his brother a descendant." His family will be known in Israel as the family of the man who had his sandal pulled off. Let that be a lesson.
A lot of love in there, isn't
Yes.
It's so bizarre.
So, well,
I mean,
Well, this
Yeah.
is the time when they're taking more than one wife, was it?
well, yeah, that would not have been an obstacle if you
No.
were already married. Yeah, and really as kind of comical as the last verse in there, the family of the one who had his sandal pulled off. You know, that was set forth as law. Now, as we also know from other things that appear in the first 5 chapters of, you know, the law, there are other things that show up in there that there's not a lot of evidence that were ever really put into practice. You know, I think of like the celebration of the year of Jubilee, where everything you own is returned to the previous owner and everyone is restored in the 50th year. Pretty certain that never really.
They lost count. They pretended they lost count.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So there's not a ton of evidence that this was widely practiced, but it certainly was. I think there's a woman in the New Testament that asked Jesus about something similar to this, that she's married several brothers who keep dying on her, and she wants to know who she will be in heaven with.
That's right,
Yeah, so it is something that, you know, at least is in the cultural mindset of how things should be, the importance being that, again, focused on the men. The men should have a male heir to promulgate the family line. And so obviously how that plays out in Ruth is Ruth loses her husband, they have no children. What's one of Naomi's arguments when she tries to send Ruth and Orpah back to Moab?
Well, she says, "I won't be having any sons for you to marry."
Yeah,
So that's not
Can't
helpful.
find your
same
own.
thing, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, in fact, it's almost like, well, when she almost makes a reference to, well, even if I did, you'd have to wait around for a while, and, yeah, so,
We haven't actually talked about the age of these people.
no.
Okay.
What do you think the ages are?
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
Ruth's been married, they've been married for 10 years, I think
Mhm.
it says.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, they married young, didn't they? Probably she was a teenager.
probably mid-teens, yeah,
14, 15, I don't know.
yeah,
And so, she must have been sort of in her mid-20s, one assumes,
probably,
by the time, you know, her husband dies,
yeah,
and she then makes this decision.
yeah,
So she was by then a more mature person in her thinking,
sure,
and she's been obviously with her mother-in-law and the rest of the family in a Jewish way,
yeah,
maybe. And I love the fact that she says, you know, your God will be my God.
Mm.
It must have been because of the way they were in their lives, because of their belief in God, that she wanted a part of it.
Well, and that she was comfortable and capable of making that
And she was
commitment.
because she was that much older.
Yeah.
Whereas
Okay.
she probably didn't think of that at the time that she married him, when she was,
Yeah.
she probably didn't have much say in the matter.
No,
She was
probably
13,
not.
14, whatever.
Yeah. Well, and
Who knows?
yeah, so I think you're right. I think probably, Ruth and Orpah are probably mid-20s.
Yeah.
And Naomi probably is maybe late 30s or 40.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it, at that time, I mean, the life expectancy was probably low to mid-40s.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Naomi at 40 would have been quite an older
Yeah.
person. Yeah. So, there is another example of that sort of marriage, and it's in Genesis chapter 38. And what I think I will do is probably summarize it, because this is it's a good read if you want to go back and look at it when you get home.
Oh, this is Tamar.
Yeah, this is the story of Judah and Tamar. I told you that it would come back up. Before I summarize this, does anybody off the top of their head know the story of Judith and Tamar? No. So,
There's an oratorio called Judith.
okay,
You know,
okay.
the Lord and Father of mankind.
Yeah, yeah.
That tune, it says in the hymn book, it's taken from, I can't remember the composer's name, from his oratorio Judith.
Oh, okay, okay.
Sure.
Well, Judah is, well, I say that now, Judah is one of the sons of Jacob, yes. So, so the story is that Judah marries his oldest son to Tamar. And for some reason, God doesn't really like this oldest son, so kills him. They don't have any offspring. So Tamar is then married to the second eldest son. The second eldest son knows that if she conceives and gives birth to a child, it will not be his, it will be his brother's. And so he's not real interested in that. And so I'm not sure how it says in here, but in my translation, every time he went into Tamar, he spilled his seed on the ground to avoid impregnating her, which God didn't like, and so God killed him. So Judah has a much younger son who's not yet old enough to be married. And so he tells Tamar, you'll get to marry him when he's old enough, go back home, I'll let you know, type of thing. With the intent that he's not giving his youngest son to her because the first two haven't done so well being married to her. She realizes what's going on and realizes her vulnerability as not having any children. And so when the time has passed, when Judah should have offered this other son to her, he doesn't. So she finds out that he's going to be in the area where she's living, shearing some of his sheep. And so she dresses as a prostitute and sits at the gate, and he hires her and wants to know what the fee will be. And she says, one of your sheep. And he says, well, I don't have one on me, but I'll send you one. And she says, as a deposit, I need something as a deposit. And so she asks for his signet and a couple other, and his rod, a couple other items that would kind of identify him. And so she becomes pregnant, and Judah gets excited because he's got an out now, because she has been acting the whore, as it says, and she has not been faithful to her status of being a widow. And so he tries to absolve the commitment to offer his youngest son in marriage. And she says, yep, you're right. I did do this. If you know who these belong to, let him know that's whose child this is. And he recognizes it. And yes. And so, but the really interesting part of the story is at the very end. She is pregnant with twins. And you know how twins go in the Old Testament, right? It's never, the birth order is never so it says, when the time came for her to give birth, it was discovered that she was going to have twins. While she was in labor, one of them put out an arm. The midwife caught it, tied a red thread around it, and said, this one was born first. But he pulled his arm back, and his brother was born first. Then the midwife said, so this is how you break your way out. So he was named Perez. Then his brother was born with the red thread on his arm, and he was named Zerah. So when you get to the end of Ruth, and you look at the genealogy, Perez is in the genealogy. Yes, and is also in the one that we read in Matthew.
Yeah.
So that's the story of Perez. So
did he do anything else?
He showed up in the genealogy and
I mean,
everything.
there isn't any other mention elsewhere in the Bible.
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
So, but I think that's a clue to. So that story is about kind of the same situation that Ruth finds herself in.
Yeah.
And it's in the background, and it's not, the only mention we get of it is in that genealogy, but I think that's also a clue to what happened in that story. How does that story comment on the story that we're reading today? Okay, so one other piece that I'll give you. If you want to turn to Genesis 19, verse 30, we know that Naomi and her family, why did they leave Bethlehem? Famine. Yeah. And where did they go? Moab. Now, for the people who first read this story, that would have been shocking, because Moab was possibly the worst place you could go. And so we're going to find out why, because chapter 19, verses 30 to 38 are the origins of the Moabites and the Ammonites. Anyone want to read that?
Yeah, I'll read that.
Okay.
Because Lot was afraid to stay in Zoar, and his two daughters moved up into the hills and lived in a cave, the elder daughter said to her sister, our father is getting old, and there are no men in the whole world to marry us, so that we can have children. Come on, let's make our father drunk so that we can sleep with him and have children by him. That night they gave him wine to drink, and the elder daughter had intercourse with him, but he was so drunk that he didn't know it. The next day the elder daughter said to her sister, I slept with him last night, now let's make him drunk again tonight and you sleep with him. Then each of us will have a child by our father. So that night they made him drunk, and the younger daughter had intercourse with him. Again he was so drunk that he didn't know it. In this way both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their own father. The elder daughter had a son who she named Moab. He was the ancestor of the present-day Moabites. The younger daughter also had a son whom she named Ben-Ami, he was the ancestor of the present-day Ammonites, which presumably wasn't a fossil in those days.
Yes, yes. And so all of that takes place immediately after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot's wife famously turns into the pillar of salt, and that's why he's alone with his daughters. So, out of that tradition, Moabites would have had the sort of, I mean, that's what they came from. They came from incest and immorality. And so obviously they were people who were, you know, not to be interacted with. And so, so I think that works in a couple of ways. One, it gives us a sense of, if you think about the moment that Naomi and Ruth walk back into Bethlehem after being gone for more than 10 years. And I think it mentions in there that they don't immediately recognize Naomi. And they can probably tell that this other woman with her is from Moab, perhaps. You know, think about the reaction and the reception, and what would people have thought? Why would you go to Moab in the first place? I mean, that's probably another question.
Why? Because they said they deliberately went to Moab.
Yeah.
Because there was good crops there.
Yeah, there was food there, wasn't there?
Food there.
Yeah.
Was it because the only place, was it just because it's nearby? Or we don't know if
We don't know.
where it was, do we?
Yeah, we don't know. But I mean, obviously they
If they
were,
were sort of nomadic tribes, it could be anywhere.
could have been. And obviously they stayed, and obviously it was fine to intermarry their sons. Some of the stuff I read said that the curse of the Moabites was only on the men. So it was okay to marry the women, which again was kind of a convenient.
It's strange, because it's the women's idea in the first place, all this.
Yes,
incest.
yeah. So, but again, I think that if we put ourselves in the context of the people who would have first heard or read this story, they would have certainly known who the Moabites were and what their story was.
Was it actually a country? I mean, is it a place still now or not?
That is a good question. Well, it was a physical location because it was east of,
There's a map in here.
Dead Sea.
On
east of
page
the Dead
14.
Sea, yeah.
Page 14.
Oh, I was looking.
It's got all these places: Canaan, Ammon, Moab, Edom.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Yep.
yeah.
East of the Dead Sea.
Yep.
They're all east of Canaan.
Yep.
But you know, we have. But most of these places seem to be names of people. that are
Probably
referred
were,
to.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and probably, you know, as probably is the case even today, whoever discovers them
Yeah.
names them, even though,
It's like the sons, aren't they? You know, there's Dan and Judah and all those that they all had their own area that they were
Yes.
given, weren't they?
yes,
Yeah.
that's right,
Yeah.
that's right. So anyway, so that's a whole lot of backstory on this story. Probably took longer to go through that than it would have to have read the story of Ruth. But I think it's important to know because all of that is in the background of what's going on.
It colours what happens, doesn't it? And
It does.
people's perceptions of them.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, if you say somebody like the Samaritans, you know, we don't do anything with Samaritans, you know.
Yeah.
So.
yeah. Well, and if you didn't know, you just think, oh, it's Samaritans, it's somebody else, it's some other, you know, like the French or the Scots or something, you know,
Yeah.
just another location. But yeah, but when you know why and how people felt about these other tribes and these other groups of people. Yeah, it does kind of flavor things a little bit. So, having said all that, what do you think? What did you hear or see in that first chapter that really jumped out at you, or that you had questions about, or just what struck you?
Ruth being the person to say to Boaz, will you marry me? That's all the prophet was trying to and what, but from what we've said today, I understand that a bit more.
But it probably still was you think about the action throughout the story of the women. How remarkable it probably was even at that time, not knowing how far. Moab was obviously far enough away that it was some journey, but that these two unmarried women made this journey. And then subsequently, the other actions in this story, what kind of strong female characters those are, especially given the context in which all this, in the time when all of this took place.
I was going to say, it would have been quite hard for Ruth to leave her, to let Naomi go off on her own, which would be even worse than going with her, wouldn't it?
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
If they'd both gone back home as she instructed, she'd have been completely on her own.
You said, how did they know whether Naomi was from Moab? But in this Bible, there's the little sketch pictures. And actually, you can tell one's older than the other because one's got a stick.
Yeah.
And also they're dressed differently.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there would have been identifying characteristics, and probably, we think about our situation, being here on the edge of a large city with the diversity of different races and ethnicities that are involved, and so it doesn't strike us, to see someone who looks different than we do. But you think about, these little settlements that were fiercely insular, you can imagine if her skin was a different shade, or there was some sort of, physical something that sort of identified her. Or her clothing, or any of that, or
if you go on a bus or a train, that's probably the first thing you notice about people of different backgrounds. If they're wearing different types of clothing.
So I think that, I think it's remarkable, and I think it's remarkable probably in the scope of history, that this gets included. That this is when they put the Bible together, stories like this, you think about who it was that made those choices.
Yeah.
Groups of men.
I was going to say, they would have been men.
Yeah. So I think, so I think that's a theme throughout, is the strength of the women and how they navigated what really was a very difficult subject or situation, rather.
I think Ruth would have been aware of how she would be received in Bethlehem. To start with, she's a Moabite. She possibly wears jewellery that would recognise her as a Moabite.
Yeah.
She's a widow. She's with another widow, an older lady. They are very vulnerable. They have nothing to take with them, nothing to say, I've got some money, where will they live, how will they eat, how will they be looked after, which is why Ruth eventually asked Boaz to marry her, because she thinks he's responsible for her as a relative.
Yeah.
It must have been a lot of trust, because she wouldn't know that there was Boaz waiting for her, would she? So you know.
Yeah, it doesn't seem
Well,
like,
she says that there's someone, she knew they had a relative there. That's the beginning of chapter 2.
Ah, you're jumping ahead.
yeah,
Yeah, but Naomi says, "Don't come back with me," and Ruth is potentially throwing away her future completely.
that's right, that's right. Well, you've got to think Naomi is thinking, no one's going to accept you. You know, I know what my people think about your people.
Yeah.
Do you think when Naomi, so the whole scene when Naomi tells the two daughters-in-law to go back home, you know, I think that's a really, obviously it's pivotal, but it's really interesting. So think about, who is it that does what the mother-in-law tells them to do? Orpah, yeah. And I think it's easy to read this and think, oh, well, she just ditched them out in the middle of nowhere. But it's really, she was being the obedient one, which would have been, I'm sure, what was expected from your elder and your mother-in-law. I mean, you know. Yeah, so what's it say that? It's interesting that it doesn't characterize any other conversation that they have the rest of the way back to Bethlehem.
Yeah.
So you wonder, did Naomi just take off walking and Ruth just kind of followed her, or did they go together? You know, how Naomi seems very concerned about the future and well-being of the two daughters. How badly do you think she wanted them to turn around? Or do you think she just needed to say,
Are you sure?
yeah,
So in verse 18 says that we recognise that Ruth was, well, you say headstrong, but decided to give her away.
Do you think, though, that Naomi had talked about her faith in the God of where she of Bethlehem, if you like, and because of this verse, I think, you know, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. She must have, they must have talked about it for Ruth to be able to profess, you know, that she wants to be
yeah,
part of it.
yeah.
Which is why she went which is why she went with her.
Well, you would think probably in that context, in that family context, I mean, the daughters-in-law probably would have been expected to adopt. I mean, if they married into the family,
Yeah, that would be,
you know,
yeah.
they would take on that faith. Yeah, it's difficult because you don't know who was the god in Moab, or gods,
Yeah, was there a God?
you know.
Gods.
Yeah. So
Did they still recognise Yahweh? Or did they have, it doesn't mention they have
No,
idols or
no.
anything like that. Or,
no, and I think that probably would have been one of
the
the.
Samaritans, later on, they just didn't recognise the temple or something.
Yeah, the Samaritans were more a faction.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think Moab would have generally been a whole different religious structure and had their own gods, and I think most of these little settlements or countries or whatever you want to call them all kind of had their own, you know.
Yeah, faith systems, if you like.
Exactly, yeah, and so so it probably was an interesting dynamic when this Jewish family shows up in Moab to begin with. How did they fit into that community? How did they go about finding young women or girls to marry their sons? I mean, it may have been a financial transaction, I don't know, but I mean, you would think there were, as much as the the Jews didn't like the Moabites, you gotta kind of think maybe there was some similar feelings going the other direction, you know.
They would have had traditions of some
Sure.
sort of their own.
But through the ages, the people have sold off their daughters, haven't they, to make either political gain or to take over or to
Sure.
keep the peace,
Sure.
all sorts of things.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been used as chattels for thousands of years, so,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, yeah. And so unfortunately, I mean, we don't have all of that to kind of go on. But obviously, the relationship with Naomi is strong. You know, that,
But the relationship with Naomi is a legal relationship.
yes,
And it's something that we find difficult now because the daughter-in-law has a different status now to the status that these women would have had. They were taken as daughters-in-law, they were taken into the husband's family, which is where we get the tradition of taking on our husband's names.
yeah,
But this was the point, that they were the property then
Yeah.
of that family. So the girls were the property of Naomi.
yes.
And these other tribes and that, they didn't have any writings. So
Yeah.
You know, so we only know from artifacts and bits and pieces,
Yeah.
you know, the archaeological prep. This is where the Jewish tradition, going on to us, is it's sometimes called the religion of the book, isn't it?
Yeah,
Because
Yeah.
it was written down.
yeah. Well, and one of the things that I read yesterday about it was the suggestion that that when this story was originally part of the oral tradition, that it may likely have been a woman who told the story,
Told the story.
which does give it a different voice and sense than some of the other stuff that we read, especially of a similar time period. So, yeah, so that was a little bit of backstory, a little bit of conversation about the first chapter. So next week, we will focus on Ruth meets Boaz, and we can talk about some of the things that are going on in that situation. We can talk about the traditions that was mentioned earlier about why and how it is that she's allowed to be in the field and glean there, and yeah, go from there. So what I'll do to close us is, we did music the last time, and my speaker turned off, so I'm gonna turn it back on here real quick. I think. Can never remember which button it is. That one. So what I have decided to do, didn't want to pass it down. For this study, we'll end our time each week with come on now.
Thank you so much.
Give me 1 second, make sure this is connected.
There's a spare one.
This will be a Taizé chant. Does everybody know what Taizé is? Have you heard of Taizé? So Taizé is a sort of meditative form of singing. It comes out of a Catholic tradition, but is used by a number of different groups ecumenically. It is basically sung. You'll see that's a fairly short refrain, and it's sung sort of in a repeated manner with the idea that it's almost like a chant. You sing it for a while, and then you don't even think about the words, and it's transcending. So I thought that was appropriate for the season of Advent, for the season of early darkness, and physically and sometimes spiritually, for the sense of darkness that Ruth and Naomi would have felt walking into the town of Bethlehem. So, with that, I wish you all a good day, and look forward to seeing you next week.